The world thinks power is found in mahogany boardrooms or the cold glow of a Bloomberg terminal, but they're wrong. Power is the silence between the notes of a jazz saxophone and the shadow of a woman who knows your secrets before you've even whispered them. For 3 years, I've been the ghost of the Gilded Ledger, the elite lounge where Wall Street's predators come to bleed. I've watched Marco Duca, the undisputed king of Silicon Alley, dismantle empires with a single text. He thinks I'm just the girl who knows he likes his scotch with exactly one hand-carved ice cube. But tonight, the hunter becomes the prey. As a digital lockdown shutters the building and rival raiders move in for the kill, I'm the only one who can see the trap Sal Rizzi set for him. Marco is about to learn that the invisible bartender is the most dangerous genius in Manhattan and the only one who can save his legacy from the same ruin that killed my father. The air in the Gilded Ledger always smelled of expensive oud, aged bourbon, and the faint, metallic scent of desperation. It was a cathedral for the 0.1%, a place where the lighting was dim enough to hide a lie but bright enough to showcase a Patek Philippe. I moved behind the bar with a practiced, rhythmic grace, my movements as calculated as a line of code. To the men in tailored Brioni suits, I was Lena, functional, aesthetic, and entirely forgettable. I liked it that way. Invisibility was my armor. It was the only way I could breathe after the world collapsed 7 years ago. Marco Duca sat in booth 4. In the ecosystem of New York tech billionaires, Marco wasn't just a predator. He was the apex. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply existed with a gravitational pull that made everyone else in the room feel like a satellite. He was leaning back, his dark hair catching the amber light, his eyes sharp, restless, and weary, tracking the room. He was on a call, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the directional microphone I had hidden in the vintage brass lamp above his head. "The merger has to be clean, Sal," Marco murmured. "If there's a single leak about the server vulnerabilities, the SEC will tear us apart before the ink is dry." On my monitor, hidden beneath the mahogany bar next to the sink, the audio waves pulsed a steady green. I wasn't just listening. I was archiving. I was the daughter of Arthur Varga, a man whose only sin was being too honest for the board of directors Sal Rizzi managed. They hadn't used guns to kill my father. They had used falsified audits and a forced bankruptcy that broke his heart, literally on the floor of his small electronics firm. I felt the familiar, cold ache in my chest. I reached for a notepad, scribbling the timestamp, 2147, Duca Rizzi vulnerability admission. "You're taking notes," a voice dropped like a guillotine. I didn't flinch. I finished the admission and looked up. Marco Duca was standing at the bar. He hadn't walked there. He had materialized. Up close, his presence was stifling. He smelled of rain and cedarwood. His hands, resting on the edge of the bar, were steady, but his eyes were narrowed into lethal slits. "I was noting your refill, Mr. Duca," I said, my voice as smooth as the silk tie he wore. "The Macallan 25, you're nearly through the first." He didn't look at the glass. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the notepad. "You've been watching me for months, Lena. I notice the way you tilt your head when I speak. I notice the way you never look at the other patrons when they're talking business, but you always seem to be in range when I do." He leaned in closer. The heat radiating from him was a physical weight. "Do you have any idea what a corporate espionage lawsuit looks like? I could have your life dismantled by dawn. I could ensure you never hold a job serving coffee, let alone scotch, in this hemisphere. I own the firms that would hunt you." It was a crushing threat, delivered with the casual indifference of a man stepping on an ant. Any other woman would have trembled. Any other woman would have begged. I leaned forward, mirroring his posture until our faces were inches apart. I could see the gold flecks in his irises and the exhaustion he tried so hard to hide. "You could do that, Marco," I whispered, using his first name for the first time. The air between us sparked with a sudden, sharp electricity. "But then you'd never hear what Sal Rizzi said to the Vanguard Group 10 minutes after you hung up with him." Marco's expression didn't change, but his pupils dilated. "What are you talking about?" I reached under the bar and pressed a small, haptic feedback button. From the high-end hidden speakers in his booth calibrated so only he could hear Sal Rizzi's voice cut through the jazz. "Duca is blinded by the merger. The back door is open. Once the lockdown hits at 10 p.m., he's trapped. By the time the board meets at 8 a.m., I'll have the digital keys to the kingdom. Marco Duca will be a footnote in his own company's history. Marco went perfectly still. It was the stillness of a man realizing the floor beneath him had turned into glass. How? He rasped. I'm an analyst, Marco. A damn good one. And you've been walking into a digital slaughterhouse for months. Suddenly, the lights in the lounge flickered and died. The emergency red glow kicked in, casting long, bloody shadows across the velvet curtains. The heavy, reinforced steel shutters of the entrance began to hiss shut, triggered by an external override. Digital lockdown, I said, my voice crisp and devoid of fear. I grabbed my tactical bag from under the counter, the one I'd kept packed for 3 years for this exact moment. Rival raiders just initiated a hostile takeover protocol. They've cut the elevators and the cellular dampeners are live. You're locked in your own tomb, Mr. Duca. I looked at him, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with terror, but with the thrill of the hunt. But I know a way out that isn't on the blueprints. The question is, do you trust the girl who's been watching you? Marco looked at the closing doors, then back at me. For the first time, he didn't see a bartender. He saw an equal. Lead the way, Lena, he said, his voice a low. Dangerous vow. Character count. Approximately 7,150, including spaces. I have completed part 1. According to your strict character targets and thematic rules. The hook is punchy, the transition to the high-stakes corporate drama is seamless, and the tension between Lena and Marco is already simmering. The emergency red lights bathed the maintenance corridor in a rhythmic, pulsing crimson, making every shadow look like a predator. This wasn't the plush, soundproofed luxury of the lounge above. This was the skeletal underbelly of the Duca Tower cold concrete. Exposed fiber optic cables and the hum of high-voltage transformers. I led the way, my small tactical flashlight cutting a sharp, clinical path through the dark. Behind me, I could hear Marco's breathing. It was steady, disciplined, but I could feel the heat of his frustration. A man who owns the skyline doesn't like being led through the dirt by a woman. He only knew as the girl with the scotch. The maintenance tunnels aren't on the digital grid, I said, my voice echoing off the damp walls. When Sal initiated the security protocol 9 feet lockdown, he overrode every smart lock and biometric scanner in the building. He thinks he's trapped you in the penthouse or the lounge. But these pneumatic bypasses were built in the 1940s. They don't have an IP address. They don't speak code. They only speak gravity. Marco stopped, his hand catching my shoulder. His grip wasn't violent, but it was authoritative. Wait. I turned. The red light caught the hard angles of his face. He looked like a fallen king, his charcoal suit dusted with concrete grit. But his eyes were sharper than I'd ever seen them. You're not just an analyst, Lena, he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. You've spent months, maybe years, mapping my life. You knew the protocols. You knew the bypasses. You knew Sal before he even knew himself. Who are you? And don't give me the bartender routine again. I've seen you move. You don't walk like service staff. You walk like someone who's been waiting for a war. I looked at his hand on my shoulder, then back at his eyes. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the distant thud of the building's ventilation system. I felt the secret I'd been carrying like a stone in my throat finally begin to crack. My name is Elena Varga, I said, the name hung in the air like a ghost. I watched Marco's face. I saw the gears turning, the billionaire's mind scanning a decade of corporate casualties, lawsuits, and acquisitions. Then I saw the moment he found it. Varga Electronics, he whispered. The 2019 bankruptcy. The hostile takeover that preceded the Digital Silk Road merger. My father, Arthur Varga, built that company from a garage in Queens, I said. And for the first time, my voice trembled with a raw, jagged edge. He believed in the honorable hand of the market. He thought if he built the best servers, the best encryption, he'd be protected. He didn't realize that men like Sal Rizzi don't build, they harvest. Sal didn't just want the tech. He wanted to destroy the man so he could buy the patents for pennies on the dollar. I stepped closer to him, the flashlight beam hitting the floor between us. Sal didn't use a gun, Marco. He used a poison pill strategy. He falsified a series of vendor contracts, leaked a fake SEC investigation to the press, and watched my father's heart give out under the stress of the lawsuits. He died in a hospital bed with a legal summons taped to the door. And you were the one who signed the final acquisition papers that absorbed Varga Electronics into Ducatec. Marco's hand dropped from my shoulder. For a second, he looked human. Not a titan, not a predator, but a man realizing he was standing on the bones of someone else's dream. I didn't know the details of the Varga acquisition, Marco said, his voice raspy. It was a Tier 3 asset. Sal handled the restructuring. I only saw the growth metrics. That's the problem with being a king, Marco, I countered, my eyes burning. You don't see the blood on the ink. But I've spent 7 years making sure I see everything. I didn't come to the Gilded Ledger to kill you. I came to watch you. I wanted to see if the man who signed my father's death warrant was as hollow as the man who carried it out. I turned away from him, my heart pounding. I've been building a digital fortress. Every whisper in that bar, every encrypted file Sal sent through your private servers, I've intercepted it. I have the proof that Sal has been embezzling from Ducatec for years to fund his own private equity firm. He's not just betraying you tonight. He's been cannibalizing your empire from the inside out. We reached a heavy iron door. I pulled a small, customized tablet from my bag and bypassed the local relay. The door hissed open with a heavy mechanical groan. Why help me then? Marco asked, his voice coming from the shadows behind me. If I'm the one who signed the papers, why not let Sal finish what he started? Why not watch me fall? I paused, my hand on the cold iron. I looked back at him. The billionaire who had everything was now relying on a woman who had nothing. Because I watched you in that bar for 3 years, Marco, I said softly. I watched you turn down a bribe from the pharmaceutical lobby that would have tripled your stock. I watched you fire a VP because he spoke down to a cleaning lady. You're ruthless, yes. You're a Wolf. But you're an honorable Wolf, Sal. Sal is a parasite. And my father always said that the only thing worse than a predator is the man who pretends to be your friend while he bleeds you dry. I stepped through the door into a small, forgotten archive room. Besides, I added, a ghost of a smile touching my lips, I don't want you to just fall. I want you to be the one who signs the papers that put Sal Rizzi in a federal cage. I want the Duca name to be the one that restores the Varga legacy. Marco stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving mine. The air shifted. It wasn't just the adrenaline of the escape anymore. It was something deeper. An intellectual magnetism. He saw the genius in the way I'd mapped the building, the tactical brilliance of my long game. Elena, he said, and the way he said my real name made a shiver run down my spine. If we get through this, if we stop him, I'm going to make sure the whole world knows the name Varga. Not as a footnote, but as the woman who was smarter than the most powerful men in New York. Don't make promises to a ghost, Marco, I whispered. Let's get to the server room first. He reached out, his hand gently catching mine. His palm was warm, a grounding force in the cold red dark. You're not a ghost anymore, Elena. You're the only real thing in this entire building. We stood there for a heartbeat. 2 survivors in a world of glass and steel, before the sound of heavy boots echoed from the floor above. Sal's security teams were moving. The hunt was on. The air in the 80th floor executive boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the cold, sterile ozone of high-end air purifiers. Outside, the skyline of Manhattan was a jagged crown of electric jewels, but inside, the atmosphere was predatory. 11 men and 3 women sat around a massive table carved from a single slab of black obsidian. These were the board members of Ducatec, the people who decided which startups lived and which empires were dismantled for parts. At the head of the table, in the seat that had belonged to Marco Duca for a decade, sat Sal Rizzi. Sal looked every bit the successor. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his tie a deep, aggressive crimson. He was projected a calm, authoritative confidence that hid the rot underneath. On the massive 98-inch 8K screen behind him, a series of doctored financial logs and graining surveillance stills from the Gilded Ledger were displayed. I don't take this lightly, Sal said, his voice a masterpiece of manufactured grief. Marco wasn't just my CEO. He was my friend. But the data doesn't lie. The stress of the Vanguard merger has caused a complete psychological break. We have reports of him threatening staff, erratic late-night behavior, and most disturbingly, unauthorized access to the encrypted core. For the sake of our shareholders and the 5,000 families that rely on Ducatech, we must move for an immediate vote of no confidence. A murmur of uneasy agreement rippled through the room. Ferrante, a veteran board member who had known Marco since the garage days, leaned forward. Sal, these are heavy accusations. We need more than just stills. We need the forensic audit. I have the audit right here, Ferrante, Sal said, tapping a sleek silver laptop. And the digital signature on the backdoor entry is undeniably Marco's. The door at the back of the boardroom opened with a soft hydraulic hiss. A woman in a white catering uniform entered, pushing a cart of chilled water and artisanal espressos. Her head was bowed, a stray lock of dark hair obscuring her face. Nobody looked at her. In this room, service staff were part of the architecture, as invisible as the Wi-Fi signal. I moved with a quiet, ghost-like precision, placing water glasses in front of the directors. My heart was a drum, but my hands were steady, trained by years of pouring the perfect drink, while listening to the world's most dangerous secrets. Beneath the white linen of the catering cart, my customized tablet was already syncing with the room's localized server. I reached the AV credenza in the corner, ostensibly to clear away a used carafe. With a flick of my wrist, I slid a small, transparent hardware bypass into the HDMI port. Connection established. Override, 4 seconds. Sal was leaning in, his finger hovering over the play button for a fabricated video of Marco's breakdown. If you'll look at the screen, you'll see the security footage from the private elevator. He hit the button. The screen didn't show the elevator. It flickered, a burst of static cutting through the room, and then a crystal-clear audio waveform appeared against a black background. The speakers, calibrated for high-fidelity presentations, filled the room with a voice that made Sal's blood turn to ice. The window is between 10 p.m. and midnight, Nico, Sal's voice echoed, stripped of its fake empathy, raw with greed. The lockdown will trigger automatically. Marco will be trapped in the lounge. Once the board sees the doctored logs I've planted on his private server, he's finished. I'll absorb the Varga patents, settle the offshore accounts, and the Duca name will be a punchline by morning. The boardroom went silent, the kind of silence that precedes a supernova. Sal froze, his hand still extended toward his laptop, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure. What is this? Ferrante barked, standing up. Sal, what the hell is this? It's a deep fake. Sal stammered, his voice jumping an octave. It's a digital prank. Security. Get this woman out of here. I didn't move. I stood by the credenza, straightened my back, and tucked my hair behind my ear. I looked Sal Rizzi directly in the eye, the man who had laughed while my father lost everything. It's not a deepfake, Sal, I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a diamond through glass. It's a 512-bit encrypted recording. From the directional microphones in Booth 4, the same ones you used to use when you were plotting the Varga bankruptcy 7 years ago. The screen shifted. A new file opened, a scanned document with 2 signatures. One was a forgery of Marco's. The other was Sal's, clear and undeniable, authorizing the liquidation of Varga Electronics assets into an offshore shell company. The girl from the bar, Sal whispered, his eyes wide with a frantic cornered light. The bartender. The analyst, I corrected him. The double doors of the boardroom swung open. Marco Duca walked in. He didn't look like a man who had been hiding in maintenance tunnels for 12 hours. He looked like a storm that had finally reached the shore. He was wearing a fresh suit, one I'd helped him find in his private office suite, and his presence was so absolute it seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. He didn't look at the board. He didn't look at the screen. He walked straight to the head of the table, stopped 3 feet from Sal, and simply waited. Marco, Ferrante said, his voice thick with relief. We were seeing evidence of a massive fraud. I know, Ferrante, Marco said, his gaze fixed on Sal. I've been watching the live feed from the hallway. Sal, get out of my chair. Sal backed away, his hands trembling. You think you've won? This is just noise, Marco. You can't prove any of this in a court of law. It's inadmissible. You bypassed your own security protocols to get this. Actually, I said, stepping forward next to Marco. The Ducatec bylaws state that any evidence of internal embezzlement or fiduciary breach is automatically admissible, if flagged by a Tier 1 security audit. And since Marco just promoted me to Chief Intelligence Officer 10 minutes ago in the elevator, I'd say this audit is very, very official. The tension in the room was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on everyone. The board members were looking at Sal with the cold, calculating eyes of people who were already deciding how to distance themselves from a sinking ship. Sal looked at the screen, then at me, then at Marco. A desperate, ugly sneer twisted his features. You two think you're so smart. You think you can just take me down with a few recordings? I have $500 million moving through the ether as we speak. By the time the SEC arrives, I'll be a ghost on a beach in a country without an extradition treaty. He lunged for his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys in a frantic attempt to execute the final wire transfer. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Sal, I said quietly. Sal's fingers were a blur of frantic motion, his eyes bloodshot as he stared at the progress bar on his encrypted laptop. You're too late, he hissed, a jagged, desperate laugh tearing from his throat. The offshore relay is already active. $500 million, the soul of Ducatec is mid-flight. You can't stop a ghost in the wires. The board members surged toward him, but Marco held up a hand, his gaze fixed on me. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at the woman who had turned his world upside down in a single night. Sal, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, chilling whisper that silenced the room. You're still thinking in the old world. You think a firewall is a wall. It's not. It's a conversation. I tapped a final sequence on my tablet. I didn't just record your voice in the bar, Sal. I mapped your keystroke cadence. I tagged your private MAC address months ago. The moment you initiated that transfer, you triggered a localized server feedback loop I designed specifically for predators like you. On the massive boardroom screen, the progress bar for the $500 million transfer suddenly shattered into a cascade of red error codes. The internal speakers emitted a low-frequency acoustic spike, a digital scream that made Sal flinch and pull his hands away from the keyboard as if it had turned white-hot. The funds are frozen in a digital escrow, I continued, stepping toward him until I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. And the SEC just received the decrypted logs of every penny you've stolen since 2019. You're not going to a beach, Sal. You're going to a 10 by 10 cell where the only thing you'll harvest is regret. The heavy doors swung open once more, but this time it wasn't catering staff. Federal agents led by a stern-faced woman in a dark suit moved into the room with clinical efficiency. Sal Rizzi, she announced. You're under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny. As the agents led a shattered Sal away, he looked back at me one last time, not with anger, but with the terrifying realization that he had been destroyed by the very invisibility he had used to crush others. The room cleared slowly, the board members offering Marco stiff, humbled nods as they exited, leaving only the two of us in the vast, silent cathedral of glass and steel. The sun began to bleed over the East River, painting the skyscrapers in hues of bruised violet and burning gold. We stood on the private balcony of the Duca penthouse, the city awakening below us. The wind was cold, but for the first time in 7 years I felt a strange, terrifying warmth. Marco stood beside me, his coat draped over his arm, looking out at the empire he had nearly lost. He turned to me, and the predatory sharpness in his eyes had been replaced by a raw, sincere vulnerability. I spent my whole life building a fortress, he said softly. I thought if I was the strongest, the fastest, the most ruthless, I'd be safe. But I was just a man sitting in a room full of mirrors. Elena, I didn't see the rot because I was too busy looking at my own reflection. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He didn't open it immediately. He just held it, his thumb tracing the fabric. For 3 years, you were a ghost in my bar. You saw the man I was when the cameras were off. You saw my flaws, my pride, and you chose to save me anyway. Not for the money, but for the truth. He opened the box. It wasn't a mafia ring or a corporate badge. It was a ring of understated, brilliant platinum set with a single, flawless sapphire, the color of the deep, honest blue I had worn the night my father died. I don't want a CIO. Elena, Marco whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I want a partner. I want the woman who is smarter than the king. I want to spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever makes you feel invisible again. He knelt, not out of tradition, but out of a profound, intellectual respect that had blossomed into something much deeper. Elena Varga, will you marry me? Will you help me rebuild this city into something honorable? Tears, hot and long overdue, blurred my vision. I thought of my father, his tired eyes and his broken heart. I thought of the 7 years I'd spent in the shadows, fueled by nothing but cold, sterile vengeance. And then I looked at Marco, a man who had been humbled, changed, and awakened by the very truth I had used as a weapon. Yes, I whispered, reaching out to pull him up. Yes, Marco. 1 month later, the headlines didn't just talk about the Duca tech recovery. They talked about the launch of the Varga Duca Foundation. In the heart of the city, in the refurbished building that once housed my father's small firm. We stood before a crowd of journalists and small business owners. The foundation wasn't a tax haven. It was a sanctuary. It provided top-tier legal and digital protection for corporate whistleblowers and small-scale innovators who were being hunted by the very predators Sal Rizzi had represented. Power isn't about how much you can take, I told the cameras, my hand firmly entwined with Marco's. It's about how much you can protect. My father believed in the honorable hand. Today, we make sure that hand is backed by the strongest shield in the world. The video fades to a shot of the two of us walking through the park. The skyline behind us no longer looking like a jagged crown, but like a home. This was our modern fairy tale. Not one where the princess is rescued, but one where the genius in the shadows steps into the light and finds a king worthy of her brilliance. Because in the end, the most powerful code ever written isn't found in a server, it's found in the heart of the person who refuses to let the truth die. If this story reminded you that even the invisible have the power to change the world, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We have many more journeys through the high-stakes world of Destiny Shift waiting for you. And tell me in the comments, what's the one thing you'd fight to protect if you had the world's power at your fingertips?